Good evening, everyone, and thank you for joining this important and very timely webinar, Making Lemonade Out of Lemons, Working with Anxiety and Uncertainty During COVID-19. Who could have predicted this title for a webinar just a little over a year ago? I'm Sarah Dinklage, the Executive Director of Rhode Island Student Assistance Services. We are proud to bring you this series of webinars focusing on youth mental health and trauma and the unique role that parents, educators, and communities play in fostering resilience in youth. This series is brought to you in partnership with the Rhode Island Department of Health. Located below this video, you will see a description box with links to our website and Facebook page where we will let you know when more content like this will be released. In addition to these items, we have created a post survey to get your input on the content being provided. After completing the survey, you also have the ability to receive contact hours for your time spent watching this presentation. There will be a reminder towards the end of our video to take the survey for a chance to win a $100 gift card. We are extremely fortunate to bring you Dr. Judson Brewer. Dr. Brewer is an internationally known thought leader in the field of habit change and the science of self-mastery, having combined over 20 years' experience with mindfulness training with his scientific research. He is the Director of Research and Innovation at Brown University's Mindfulness Center and Associate Professor of Psychiatry at the Medical School. Dr. Brewer has developed novel mindfulness programs for behavior change, including both in-person and app-based treatments for smoking, emotional eating, and anxiety. His work has been featured on 60 Minutes, in documentaries, books, and news outlets across the world. He is the author of The Craving Mind, From Cigarettes to Smartphones to Love, Why We Get Hooked, and How We Can Break Habits, and the book Unwinding Anxiety, New Science Shows Us How to Break the Cycles of Worry and Fear to Heal Your Mind. And I'm guessing in his spare time, Dr. Brewer makes lemonade. Thank you again for your interest in this very timely topic, and I am now pleased to turn it over to Dr. Brewer.
I do like making things actually make kombucha, which we have a lemon flavored one that's pretty good as well. Welcome everyone, and that's great introduction. What I'll do is I'll spend about 20 minutes and kind of give an overview of how we can actually make lemonade from what we're given, but it starts really with understanding how our minds work. So I'm going to share my screen. And I'll show a couple of slides, and then we'll make sure we have plenty of time to have a discussion afterwards to make sure that everything here is very clear. I thought I would start with maybe just an example of what I've been seeing over the last year around in my own psychiatric clinic around anxiety. So for example, I had a patient who was referred to me for anxiety. And what he described was that he would be driving in his car and he felt like he was in a speeding bullet, where he would start to have these anxious thoughts. And these anxious thoughts became so distressing that he started avoiding driving on the highway. And avoiding driving on the highway actually led to him, to help him kind of avoid having those panic attacks, avoid having that anxiety. So here was a patient who was tremendously anxious, yet he was struggling with being able to function because of his anxiety, both in terms of having anxiety throughout the day and also being severely limited because he was so afraid or so anxious to drive. So what would we do typically as a healthcare provider to help him with his anxiety? And I use this cartoon here because with, as a psychiatrist, I prescribe medications for anxiety, yet only about 1 in 5 patients actually benefits on average from an anxiety medication. So here we're somewhat limited by our approaches. A lot of behavioral treatments are really, focused around helping people distract themselves or kind of bring in some cognitive control as a way to work with their anxiety. Yet about 50% of people respond to these types of treatments like cognitive behavioral therapy. So, even I'll highlight this, the struggle that I have myself. So I actually used to get panic attacks in residency when I was training to be a psychiatrist. And fortunately, I started doing some mindfulness practice that helped me quite a bit. But before that, I was actually struggling with trying to learn mindfulness myself. And I found that I was taking this very Western attitude toward working with my anxiety, which is an approach that I see a lot with working with anxiety, which is just this just stop it mentality, where I would, the intention was to pay attention to my breath, and I would just try to force myself to do that. Yet I remember finding myself in my first 7-day silent meditation retreat where I was crying uncontrollably on the shoulder of the retreat manager because I couldn't pay attention to my breath. So what I'm highlighting here, and I love this quote that's attributed to Einstein, is that, we take this approach where we're just going to think our way out of anxiety. We're going to think our way out of a problem. Yet we might be approaching it from this wrong level of consciousness. And the reason I mention that is that, this willpower or the cognitive control relies on the prefrontal cortex, which is actually the youngest and the weakest part of our brain. And what this suggests is that we're not actually paying attention to how our brains work. So that's really the place to start. So I'm going to show you a short animation that kind of gives some history around how our brains work, especially as related to anxiety.
Anxiety gone viral. Why fear and uncertainty spread anxiety through social contagion, and how to protect yourself.
Anxiety is a strange beast. As a psychiatrist, I've learned that anxiety and its close cousin panic are both
born from fear. As a behavioral neuroscientist, I know that fear's main evolutionary function is helping us survive. In fact, fear is the oldest survival mechanism we've got. Fear helps us learn to avoid dangerous situations in the future through a process called negative reinforcement. For example, if we step out into a busy street, turn our head and see a car coming right at us, we instinctively jump back onto the safety of the sidewalk. Evolution made this really simple for us. So simple that we only need 3 elements in situations like this to learn: an environmental cue, a behavior, and a result. In this case, walking up to a busy street cues us to look both ways before crossing. The result of not getting killed helps us remember to repeat the action again in the future. Sometime in the last million years, humans evolved a new layer on top of our more primitive survival brain, called the prefrontal cortex. Involved in creativity and planning, the prefrontal cortex helps us think and plan for the future. It predicts what will happen in the future based on past experience. If we don't have enough information, our prefrontal cortex lays out different scenarios about what might happen next and guesses which will be most likely. It does this by running simulations based on previous events that are most similar. Enter anxiety. Anxiety is defined as a feeling of worry, nervousness, or unease, typically about an imminent event or something with an uncertain outcome. Anxiety comes up when our prefrontal cortices don't have enough information to accurately predict the future. We saw this with the novel coronavirus that was discovered in China at the end of 2019, COVID-19. Scientists raced to study the characteristics of any new virus so that we can know precisely how contagious and deadly it is, and act accordingly. Uncertainty abounds. Without accurate information, it is easy for our brains to spin stories of fear and dread. In addition to being fueled by uncertainty, anxiety is also contagious. In psychology, the spread of emotion from one person to another is termed social contagion. Our own anxiety can be cued or triggered simply by talking to someone else who is anxious. Their fearful words are like a sneeze landing directly on our brain, emotionally infecting our prefrontal cortex and sending it out of control as it worries about everything from whether our family members will get sick to how our jobs will be affected. Wall Street is a great example of social contagion. We watch the stock market spike and crash, the stock indices being a thermometer for how feverish our collective anxiety is at any one moment. Wall Street even has something known as the Fear Index, which with coronavirus outstripped the financial meltdown of 2008. When we can't control our anxiety, that emotional fever spikes into panic. Panic is defined as sudden, uncontrollable fear or anxiety, often causing wildly unthinking behavior. Overwhelmed by uncertainty and fear of the future, the rational thinking parts of our brains go offline when we're panicked. Logically, we know that we don't need a 6-month supply of toilet paper, but when we see someone else's cart piled high, their anxiety infects us and we go into survival mode. So how do we not panic? Too many times I've seen my anxious clinic patients try to suppress or think themselves out of anxiety. Unfortunately, both willpower and reasoning rely on the prefrontal cortex, which isn't available at these critical moments. Instead, I start by teaching them how their brain works, so that they can see how uncertainty weakens the brain's ability to deal with stress, priming it for anxiety when fear hits. But this is only the first step. To hack our brains and break the anxiety cycle, we need to become aware of 2 things. 1, that we are getting anxious or panicking, and 2, what the result is. This helps us see if our behavior is actually helping us survive, or in fact moving us in the opposite direction. Panic can lead to impulsive behaviors that are dangerous, and anxiety has near and long-term consequences both mentally and physically. Once we are aware of how unrewarding anxiety is, we can then deliberately bring in the bigger, better offer. Since our brains will choose more rewarding behaviors simply because they feel better, we can practice replacing old habitual behaviors such as worry with those that are naturally more rewarding. These are the bigger, better offers. For example, if we notice that we have a habit of touching our face, we can be on the lookout for when we act out that behavior. At that moment, we can step back and notice if we're starting to worry. Oh no, I touched my face. Maybe I'll catch something. And instead of panicking, we can take a deep breath and ask ourselves, when was the last time I cleaned my hands? Just by taking a moment to pause and ask the question, we give our prefrontal cortex a chance to come back online and do what it does best. Think. Oh right, I just washed my hands. Here we can leverage certainty. If we've just washed our hands and haven't been out in public, the likelihood that we're going to get sick is pretty low. The more we can see the positive feeling and effects of good hygiene and compare them to the negative feeling of uncertainty or getting caught up in anxiety, the more our brains naturally move toward the former. Because it feels better, they naturally choose the bigger, better offer. How do I know this? My lab has studied these mechanisms for decades. We've recently found that simple mindfulness training, delivered through an app called Unwinding Anxiety, can reduce anxiety by 57% in a study that we did with anxious physicians. In a second study with people with generalized anxiety disorder, we saw that anxiety went down by 63% in just a couple of months. Understanding these simple learning mechanisms will help all of us keep calm and carry on, which is how London dealt with the uncertainty of constant air raids in World War II. As we keep calm and carry on, this helps us keep from getting caught in anxiety or panic whenever we face uncertainty. When our prefrontal cortex comes back online, we can compare anxiety to what it feels like to be calm. To our brains, it's a no-brainer. It simply takes a little practice so that the bigger, better offer becomes our new habit.
So just to summarize that, this is really based on our survival brains, trigger behavior and a result or a reward. And if we can understand this process, we can actually start to work with it. So in fact, historically, there was a famous scientist, B.F. Skinner, who was famous for working with pigeons, who was really interested in understanding how behaviors are formed. And we might think, well, how does anxiety actually relate to this? Just as an example, he found that he could teach a pigeon to win a cross-court shot in ping pong for a food reward. Now, pigeons aren't particularly prone to playing ping pong, yet they will play for a reward. And what he highlighted was that this process is actually, this is a key process for learning. When there's some type of reward, we're going to keep doing that behavior. Now, with this, some folks in the 80s suggested that anxiety could actually be driven in the same manner that people form habits around food. And I'll show you how that works now.
We'll talk more about the neuroscience of our brains in a bit, but for now, let's focus specifically on how habits around anxiety are formed. We'll call it the habit loop. First, something happens in your life. It could be good or bad. It's called a trigger. For example, what does it feel like when something good happens in your life? Let's use getting a funny text or watching a cute video on your phone as an example. Your brain says, "Oh, that feels good. Do that some more," so you can keep that good feeling going. So your brain lays down this memory. Oh, next time you want to feel good, you should do that again. Now you start to associate that behavior with feeling good. The next time you hear that alert on your phone, that triggers your brain to act. Oh, I should check my phone. The more you do this, getting an alert on your phone, leading you to watch a cute video, leading you to feel good, the more this gets laid down as a habit loop. Trigger, behavior, reward. This works with negative emotions too. Have you ever just thought about how far behind you are on your to-do list? Or beaten yourself up for making a mistake or missing a deadline at school or work? How does that feel? Not so good, is it? Just like we want to have more good feelings, we want bad feelings to go away as quickly as possible. So what do we do when this happens? We get triggered by that thought or emotion and go and do something on our phones to feel better. This too lays down a memory. If you're stressed or anxious, distract yourself. You'll feel better. The more we do this, get anxious, which leads to distracting ourselves, which leads to feeling a little bit better, the more this too becomes a habit. Trigger, behavior, reward. Now, do you have stress or anxiety that seems to trigger more anxiety, feeding on itself? This might become its own type of habit loop. For example, you think of all the things you have to do today. Then you start to worry that you can't possibly get everything done. And that stressful thought triggers more worry thoughts. This goes on and on as you tighten down into a tiny ball of anxiety. In this case, stress itself can easily become a trigger for out-of-control anxiety. Instead of stress triggering us to get our to-do list done so we feel better, it triggers out-of-control worry thinking. Getting caught up in worry thinking becomes the new behavior in the habit loop. The result? We contract down into that tight little ball of anxiety. That's not much of a reward, is it? So there can be two types of habit loops that can be happening here. The one in which the behavior of doing something, like distracting ourselves, can make us feel a little bit better, and the one where the behavior is out of control thinking that just gets us all knotted up in a ball of anxiety. No matter which habit loop it is, what's tricky is that the more you get caught up in these behaviors, the more automatic they become. Over time, you're not even consciously choosing these actions anymore. It's like you're on autopilot. You're not even flying the plane.
So this gives you a sense for how anxiety can actually be driven as a habit loop. And if we can understand how it functions, we can actually start to work with it. And this is where some of the work that my lab comes in, some of the work that my lab does, which is around bringing mindfulness into the equation. So one definition of mindfulness is paying attention in the present moment on purpose and non-judgmentally. And the idea is to bring awareness in when we're caught up in these worry habit loops and be able to be with those thoughts, be with those emotions, be with those body sensations in a way where we're curious about what's happening rather than sucked into it or resisting it. And we can actually deliver mindfulness training through app-based modalities. For example, we have an app called Unwinding Anxiety that we can actually give people, short 10-minute modules a day where they can actually learn how their minds work, and then they can learn to work with their minds. We can use these short animations to drive key points home, as you just saw, and then we can give them in the moment exercises to help them work with their anxiety. And of course, as a scientist, I want to know if this stuff actually works. So we can embed things like experience sampling so that we can test to see how well they work. I'll just show you a couple of results of some of the studies that we've done around this. So for example, we did a study with anxious physicians, and we got a 57% reduction in anxiety at 3 months. We did another study with people with generalized anxiety disorder. This was a randomized controlled trial, so we could randomize people to get their usual clinical care or that plus the Unwinding Anxiety app. And you can see the folks in the Unwinding Anxiety app did significantly better than the folks that got usual clinical care. And here we get pretty good efficacy where, as I mentioned with medications, it takes treating about 5 patients before one person shows a significant reduction. Here, it's only 1.6 folks that need to use the training. And what this suggests is that just understanding these core mechanisms of how the mind works, for example, reinforcement learning or reward-based learning around anxiety, where we can specifically target that and help people. So I'm just going to finish this talk by talking about what's going on in the brain. Now, there's a brain network called the default mode network that we default to when we are thinking about the past or thinking about the future or worrying. So for example, there's this brain part called the posterior cingulate cortex that the more worried we get, the more activated this brain region becomes. And the reason I mention this is that my lab has done studies with expert meditators, and we found that in fact, this same brain region, the posterior cingulate, gets deactivated when experienced meditators are meditating. So blue means less activity relative to novice meditators. And in fact, we can even give people feedback from their own brains in real time so we can see what's happening. The way this works, we can have somebody meditate, and we can give them feedback from their brain as they're meditating. We can do a bunch of control experiments to make sure they're not fooling themselves. And we can use that as a way to see exactly what's happening in their brain and link it up to their subjective experience. We were lucky enough to have Anderson Cooper come in and try this out on camera as we were giving him feedback from his own brain. And here's what we discovered.
This is just the next generation of exercise. We've got the physical, exercise components down, and now it's about working out how can we actually train our minds.
So bringing all of this brain science together with these behavioral mechanisms, one thing we can ask ourselves is, well, how can we actually turn these lemons into lemonade? And so if we understand how we start to worry, let's say we get anxious, there's that negative emotion that drives us to worry. And that worry says, oh, you're doing something, you're worrying about this, and that just drives more anxiety. Can we actually replace this with something better? As you saw from the animation earlier, what's the bigger, better offer? Here I turn to Lewis Carroll, where Alice in Wonderland exclaims, curiouser and curiouser. So there's this attitudinal quality of mindfulness suggesting that curiosity might actually feel better than worrying. And in fact, we could replace worry with curiosity. We can get curious about what's happening in our experience in that moment. And we can tap into curiosity at any time so that it might provide some sustained relief. Here's an example of somebody that was using our Unwinding Anxiety app who said, when I first started the program, I didn't quite buy into the benefits of curiosity. Today, I felt a wave of panic. And instead of immediate dread or fear, my automatic response was, that's interesting. That took the wind right out of its sails. I wasn't just saying it was interesting, I actually felt it. I was so thrilled. So here, somebody is replacing the old habit of panic with the new habit of curiosity. And in fact, finding that bigger, better offer. So just to bring this to a close, as I mentioned, my patient came into my office with a lot of panic. He had full-blown panic disorder. He had full-blown generalized anxiety disorder. And what we had him do was start mapping out his own habits of his mind. And what he was able to do was move from being completely freaked out about driving to, and I'm not kidding, become an Uber driver. I saw him one day, he pulled up as I was walking out of class one day at teaching at the School of Public Health in Providence. His car pulls up on South Main Street. Guy rolls down the window. It's my patient. He says, "Oh, hey doc, I'm on the way to the airport to pick somebody up. I'm an Uber driver now." So that just highlights how when we understand how our minds work, we can take those lemons, that churning of the mind, and turn it into lemonade as we learn to work with our own minds. So I'll just stop there. If you are interested in learning more, we've got a bunch of free resources on my website. But if nothing else, I would say just follow Mary Oliver's instructions for living. Pay attention, be astonished, and tell about it. So I will stop the formal presentation piece there. And I think we've got a few minutes to answer some questions, if that would be helpful, or move into a discussion.
So if you would like to contribute any questions, if you have anything that you would like to say to Dr. Brewer, feel free to put it in the chat box and I will read it out.
Well, as folks are perhaps thinking of questions or shy, certainly I think, as was in the introduction, to give a shameless plug of self-promotion, if you're interested in learning more about how these habit loops around anxiety form, my new book called Unwinding Anxiety has just come out. It was published by Penguin Random House. So that's certainly something that you can check out as well.
We have a comment that says, this sounds fantastic or fascinating, sorry. And I'm looking forward to learning more about it and trying it myself. We said, one was said, what can you do immediately when there is a panic attack, helping another in the moment?
That's a great question. So here, when somebody is in a full-blown panic attack, it can be challenging to engage our thinking and brains, because as you probably saw from that animation, panic is basically, severe anxiety leading to wildly unthinking behavior. So we can't think in those moments. So here I have folks bring in a grounding practice, like a 5-finger breathing, which is a really way to ground ourselves in our present moment. I have a short YouTube video out on my YouTube channel that describes it more, but basically what we can do is, as we're paying attention to our breath, we can trace our fingers. So as we breathe in, we trace up our finger. As we breathe out, we trace down. And basically, through 5 breaths, we can trace from our pinky to our thumb, and 10 breaths, we can trace back. It's a great way to ground ourselves in a multimodal experience, because we're paying attention to 3 felt sensations at once, 2 fingers and the breathing, as well as looking at our hand. And our working memory only has so much capacity to be able to pay attention to so many things at once. So there, it can kind of crowd out our working memory so that the panic thoughts and whatnot don't have room to take hold in our brain. It's a good way to really ground. So that's one example of something we can do to ground ourselves so we can get our thinking brain back online. That's a great question.
Is the app available to everyone or anyone?
Yes, so anybody can go to the App Store. It's just called Unwinding Anxiety, and download it, or you can go to the website, unwindinganxiety.com.
We had a question, have you tested this with teens specifically?
Yes, we've done some pilot testing with teens. We haven't done any randomized controlled trials, but we've specifically designed the app to work with folks as young as 13. That's the youngest that we've tested it with, and teens seem to benefit from it.
Another question, how can we help our middle school age children with this situation during returning to school, especially as they are also working through hormones and social acceptance?
Yes, that's a great question and very challenging. So the first thing I would say is we can look at this aspect of social contagion. So as we as it could be parents, it could be peer support, it could be, family or friends. Any of us can actually spread anxiety through social contagion. So the key here is to first ground ourselves, because if we can spread anxiety through social contagion, we can also spread calm through social contagion. So helping folks kind of see that we can be grounded in uncertainty, and we can work with uncertainty in ways that are helpful. This models it to them and spreads that through social contagion. The other thing we can do is just help teenagers understand how their minds work. And it's actually why I wrote this Unwinding Anxiety book, was to help anybody be able to understand how their mind works, and how uncertainty is something that our brains, they use it as a substrate, like food, where it drives them to get information. And that's a normal survival thing. But when it spins out of control, it becomes worry and anxiety. So if we can understand how our minds work, then we can help adolescents understand how their minds work. And then they can begin to work with their minds. So it really starts with a basic understanding and also a grounding in our own experience. So thanks for that question. I think it's a really important one.
We had a comment from an attendee that said, I suffer from anxiety and panic disorders for the past 20 years on and off. Why is there times when I can get in my car and drive, and other times I'm so afraid to drive, I will use excuses not to?
Yeah, it's a really good question. And I don't know your direct experience, but one thing to explore is, at times, are you calm and collected where you can get in your car and drive? Are there times when you're triggered, or where there's a thought that's getting in there that's kind of driving kind of an avoidance habit loop, or driving anxiety that's keeping you from driving? And so it comes back to really kind of mapping out these habit loops of your mind. One thing I forgot to mention was that we've actually put together a free habit mapper that anybody can use. I will see if I can send this to everybody. It's just www.mapmyhabit.com. So there you can check out that, and that'll give you a free PDF that helps with the mapping process that I mentioned.
We had one comment. I know personally I have used with some in a panic attack, name 5 things you can see, 4 things you can hear, 3 things you can smell, 2 things you can taste, and 1 thing you can feel. And when they focus on that with their eyes closed, it seems to help. Just a simple 5, 4, 3, 2, 1, and the 5 senses in any order.
Yeah, that's a great example of grounding ourselves in the present moment, and really using all of that working memory space up to keep us paying attention to what's happening right now, so that that wildly unthinking mind, gets crowded off stage. So it's a great simple practice to do to ground.
The last question that I see is, have you done any research on the effectiveness of these techniques with trauma survivors coping with panic/anxiety?
It's a really good question. So we have a number of folks, a number of trauma survivors who have used our Unwinding Anxiety app and have found benefit from it. We haven't done any formal research studies with trauma survivors to this point.
Does anybody in the audience have any more questions? In the meantime, what I will say is I am posting in our chat box a copy of the survey. So please feel free to go over to there. At the end of the survey, there is a link to send you to the page where you can get your certificates for attending today. So that is where you will find it. It's looking like a lot of thank yous. So, and I agree. Thank you, Dr. Brewer, for actually coming and giving us all of the information. It's really fascinating to see. So
it's my pleasure. Happy to help. All right. Well, take care, everyone. And I hope you can awaken your own curiosity to help you take those lemons and make lemonade.